Don't sign this. They're stealing everything.
The whisper cut through the polished silence of the boardroom like a hidden blade. It was the janitor, an old black man in a faded uniform. Charlotte Whitmore, the billionaire at the head of the table, froze with her pen midair. Every executive in the room turned, their contempt boiling into disbelief. How dare a janitor interrupt this sacred ritual of wealth? But Harold Greene didn't flinch. For a single moment, as he pushed his cart past, he lifted his gaze. His eyes didn't meet anyone else's. They locked directly onto Charlotte's. There was no challenge in them, no fear. Just the raw, heavy weight of a truth as heavy as the pen about to slip from his pocket. And then, it slipped. A soft thud on the mahogany tabletop. It was a pen, carved from dark rosewood, worn by time. She picked it up. Heavy, cold, old. An unsettling familiarity ran down her spine. This pen. It reminded her of her grandfather's, a judge who always said, "A person's signature is their honor." Questions flooded her mind. Who was this man, really? Because one thing was certain. That whisper wasn't random. It was a warning, meant only for her. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the greatest truth. Stay with this story, because by the time it ends, you'll understand how a single whisper can shatter an empire. Charlotte Whitmore held the pen. Heavy, cold, almost alive. She turned it in her hand, feeling the rosewood worn smooth by time and the invisible scars of a story she didn't know. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Never sign what you don't understand. A signature is a soul you cannot take back. Never had those words sounded so loud. Around her, the air had turned to glass. 12 executives in $1,000 suits sat frozen. The Swiss watches on their wrists seemingly stopped. All eyes were fixed on one spot, where a man in a faded blue janitor's uniform was pushing a squeaky cart. This was Harold Greene. He wasn't a large man, but his shoulders were straight and solid. His hands, calloused from labor, held the cart's handle with a firm grip. But it was his eyes that held the room captive. Deep, still, like a lake before a storm. A shadowed past seemed to swirl within them. Across from her, her silver-haired partner, Victor Delgado, remained poised. He was an architect of empires, a predator in a tailored suit who could turn ash into gold, and sometimes gold into ash. His smile was a weapon, honed over decades to be both polite and lethal. "Charlotte," Victor said, his voice smooth as silk, trying to stitch reality back together. "A momentary distraction, nothing more. Don't be distracted." He shot a look toward Harold, a glance filled with cold contempt. "History is waiting for your signature." But she couldn't. Harold's whisper still echoed, a raw truth in a room of polished lies. The pen in her hand suddenly felt like lead. Charlotte's voice tore through the silence. "Why did you say that?" Harold kept pushing his cart. Its wheels squeaked on the marble floor, a defiant sound in the luxurious room. He didn't look back. Didn't bow. That act, that dismissal, was more powerful than a challenge. "Answer me," she demanded, her voice louder now, a billionaire's patience wearing thin. Her authority was being challenged by a man who seemingly had nothing to lose. The boardroom held its breath. Only then did Harold stop and turn his head. The expensive lighting caught his face, revealing creases carved not by age, but by unseen battles. He looked directly at her, his gaze without a trace of fear, without a hint of pleading. It was simply there, steady as a lighthouse in a fog. "I can't explain," he said, his voice low and even, each word a stone dropping into a still pool. "I can only warn." He glanced down at the polished floor, where the distorted reflections of powerful people stared back. The price to clean a stain is sometimes a life. The statement hung in the air. It wasn't an accusation. It was a prophecy. An executive coughed nervously. Another muttered something about security. With that, Harold turned and pushed his cart out of the room, the squeak of its wheels the only sound to break the dead silence he left behind. Victor's fists clenched under the table, his knuckles white, but Charlotte didn't notice. She was alone with a ringing warning, the contempt of her colleagues, and a rosewood pen in her hand. The seed of doubt had been planted deep in the fertile ground of power. Charlotte didn't sign. The pen hovered in her hand, heavy, trembling as if it carried more than ink. Cameras waited outside, the board inside, but all she could hear was Harold's whisper, words from a janitor she was never meant to hear. Sophia, her sharp-witted assistant, slid closer. Her voice was a crystal razor, pragmatic and precise. "Charlotte, we're losing control. Don't reward a stunt. Sign, smile, and let legal clean up the rest." But Charlotte shook her head, her gaze fixed on the contract. "It wasn't a stunt, Sophia." He wasn't guessing. Sophia nearly rolled her eyes. "He's a janitor. Your brand is precision. Doubt right now looks like weakness." Sophia's words were a jolt of reality. She was right. She was Charlotte Whitmore. She didn't build her empire on hallway whispers. But as she looked down at the rosewood pen in her hand, that strange feeling returned. It felt intentional. Victor Delgado sensed the hesitation. He leaned forward, a smile painted with false serenity, like a priest hovering at an altar. "You want certainty," he said, his voice smooth. "Good, I've brought it." He tapped the thick folder. "Debt schedules, vendor covenants, risk controls. Every box is checked." Victor had seized the moment, turning the chaos into a display of transparency. He was applying pressure, but subtly. He was saying, "See, everything is here. The only problem is your doubt." Charlotte opened the folder. The numbers glittered. The legal language gleamed. But something felt off. "Why does it have to be today?" she asked, her voice cutting through the calm. "Because the market rewards timing," Victor answered smoothly. "Or because someone else is timing us." Silence fell. Sophia glanced at her watch, her expression tense. The pressure was mounting from all sides. From Victor, from Sophia, from the waiting cameras, from the very empire she had built. Charlotte took a deep breath, trying to reclaim control. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning quickly. And then she stopped. A small detail, an inconsistency that on any other day she might have missed. "Where's Addendum C?" Victor blinked once, a nearly invisible reaction, but in the taut air of the room it was deafening. "Pardon?" "Your index references Addendum C," Charlotte said, her voice now ice. "I don't see it in this folder." Victor shuffled papers, feigning nonchalance. "A clerical error, surely." "Then fix it," Charlotte replied, setting the pen down on the table with a sharp click. "Bring me Addendum C." Her request wasn't a question. It was an order. She was no longer wondering about the janitor. She was wondering about what wasn't there. And in Charlotte Whitmore's world, what was hidden was always more dangerous than what was on display. Charlotte's pen had not touched the paper. Doubt, once planted, always finds the cracks. And this crack ran 15 years deep. 2008. Harold Greene wasn't pushing a cart. He was 37, a sharp compliance officer who had just uncovered a fraud that could shake a corporation. His desk was a fortress of files, his rosewood pen a trusted sentinel beside him. He'd found it. A shell company, tied to Delgado Capital, siphoning the pensions of thousands of families. He brought the evidence to the boardroom. Powerful men stared at him with cold eyes. At the center, Eduardo Delgado, the patriarch and Victor's foster father, listened in dead silence. "This company is laundering money," Harold stated, his voice steady. "You must stop the merger." The reaction was immediate. Whispers, anger, then denial. Victor, younger then, stood in the corner, silently watching the humiliation brought upon his family's name. The aftermath was swift and merciless. The documents Harold presented vanished. A trusted colleague signed a counter-report, calling him paranoid. "Fabricated evidence," they whispered. The betrayal cut deeper than the lies. Eduardo Delgado sued for defamation. With an army of lawyers, he crushed Harold. Within months, Harold lost his job, his credibility, and was blacklisted from the financial industry. The pressure destroyed his family. Arguments became silence. His wife, Angela, took their daughter and left. The man who once challenged giants now had nothing. Eventually, the only job he could find was mopping the floors for the very people who had destroyed him. But Harold wasn't the only one left ruined. His revelations, though silenced, had attracted regulators. Eduardo Delgado's empire staggered. Deals collapsed. Fortunes bled. 2 years later, Eduardo died, consumed by bitterness. At his foster father's funeral, Victor stood over the grave, his jaw clenched. He didn't weep. He swore an oath. "I'll avenge you," he whispered. "The man who ruined us will crawl." From that day, Victor carried 2 obsessions: rebuilding wealth and destroying Harold Greene. He wanted Harold to live long enough to taste complete irrelevance, erased from the world he once dared to challenge. And so Harold mopped floors under Victor's shadow, a ghost in the empire he once opposed. The present. The timelines braided together. In the boardroom, Charlotte traced the grooves on the pen, unaware of the ghosts it carried. She only felt its weight. Across the table, Victor watched her with a hawk's eyes. This was more than a contract. This was the closure he had waited 15 years for. Harold's whisper had threatened to shatter it. Charlotte's voice cut through his thoughts. "Why the rush, Victor? What's hiding under these numbers?" Victor's smile didn't falter, but inside, the old battle raged anew. The janitor hadn't been destroyed. He was still here, still whispering. And Victor Delgado knew his revenge was far from finished. Victor Delgado sensed Charlotte's hesitation as a threat. He pulled out his phone and sent a short text. "Now." As Harold pushed his cart into the main lobby, 2 security officers intercepted him. "Mr. Greene," one said, his voice cold, "we need to check your belongings." From behind, Victor emerged from the boardroom, followed by Charlotte and Sophia. Victor had made this a public spectacle. "What's going on?" Charlotte asked, her eyes sharp. "Just a security protocol," Victor replied with a polite smile. "It seems some confidential documents have gone missing." In front of everyone, security searched Harold's cart and pulled out a slim folder stamped with the company's seal. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Charlotte held her breath. She knew it was a setup, but she couldn't intervene without proof. Any move she made now would be scrutinized. "You'll have to come with us," a guard said, grabbing Harold's arm. Just then, across the lobby, Marcus Greene walked in. He froze at the sight of his uncle being held by 2 large men. "Uncle Harold?" his voice called out, lost. Victor smirked. The show had its audience. "What's going on?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling as he ran closer, his eyes falling on the folder on the cart. You stole?" Harold didn't answer. He just looked directly at his nephew. To Marcus, his silence was a confession. "You're a coward," Marcus yelled, years of shame erupting into contempt, hot tears welling in his eyes. "I thought at least you were honest. Turns out you're just a thief." Charlotte wanted to say something to stop it, but she knew any words from her would be useless and only complicate things. She could only watch. "Say something," Marcus screamed. Harold remained silent. He looked directly at his nephew, not with blame, but with a deep, profound sadness. That silence, that gaze, would haunt Marcus more than any words. "I hate you," Marcus shouted, before turning and running out of the building. Security led Harold away. As they passed, Victor shot Charlotte a triumphant look. He had neutralized the threat and added a layer of humiliation. Charlotte stood frozen, her hand clenching the rosewood pen in her pocket. She had been powerless. But in that powerlessness, her suspicion hardened into resolve. Victor had gone too far, and she would find out the truth. Charlotte sat in her office long after everyone had left. The contract lay untouched, cruelly pristine. Her mind wasn't on the markets, but on the janitor's whisper and the pen still heavy in her hand. She turned it under the lamp. On the cap, nearly invisible, was a crest she knew: Harvard. She frowned. These pens were awarded rarely as a mark of excellence. Why would a janitor have one? She buzzed the intercom. "Sophia, get me Harold Greene's employment file." When Sophia brought it, her impatience was clear. "Charlotte, this is unnecessary. The man embarrassed you." "Leave me," Charlotte said softly, her eyes already on the file. She opened it. The first pages were routine, but deeper in were fragments of a deleted past. And there it was. Harold Greene, Harvard Business School, class of 1996. Graduated with honors. Former compliance officer, specialist in forensic accounting. His career soared, then ended abruptly in 2008. A single note: employment terminated. Unspecified. After that, a black hole. Charlotte leaned back. This wasn't a man who stumbled into a mop. This was someone who had once sat where she sat. What had destroyed him? She stood, looking out at the glittering city, and thought of Harold's words. The price to clean a stain is sometimes a life. That wasn't metaphor. It was memory. If Victor was pushing her this hard, if Harold risked humiliation to stop her, then the truth ran 15 years deep. She picked up her phone and called a trusted journalist. "Daniel, I need old archives. 2008. Keywords: Harold Greene, Delgado Capital." An hour later, her inbox pinged. Scans of forgotten headlines appeared. Compliance officer raises concerns over merger. Greene allegations dismissed. Delgado Capital wins defamation suit. The story was always the same. Harold Greene accused, discredited, erased. But a grainy photo from 2008 caught her breath. Harold, younger, in a sharp suit, standing alone at a press conference. His eyes were the same as today: steady, haunted, unafraid. "He was warning me, as the man who already tried," Charlotte whispered. She clicked deeper, finding a buried SEC footnote: flagged transactions, drained pension funds. Harold had been right. Her pulse quickened. This was the same playbook, and Harold Greene, the ghost of 2008, had returned with nothing left to lose. Sophia re-entered. "You're still on this? Do you know what this is?" Charlotte held up the pen. "It's Harvard's mark. This man was once at the top of our world, and he risked everything to stop a fraud tied to Victor's family." Sophia was stunned. Even if that's true, he lost. "Irrelevant men don't risk being dragged away in handcuffs just to stop me from signing a piece of paper," Charlotte retorted, her voice hard. That whisper, it wasn't desperation, it was experience. Her decision was made. She would investigate herself. That night, alone in her study, she spread the documents across her desk. The patterns emerged. Different names, but the fingerprints were familiar. Delgado. Always Delgado. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "Found something. Internal memo. 2008. Greene warned about Addendum C." Her blood ran cold. Addendum C. The very document missing from today's folder. Her doubt crystallized into determination. She would not be Delgado's pawn. She whispered to the empty room, "If he couldn't finish it 15 years ago, I will." She was no longer just protecting her wealth. She was carrying a stranger's unfinished war, and she knew exactly where to begin. Harold was released after hours of questioning. Security found nothing more than the planted folder, and without proof, they had to let him go. He walked slowly down the dim corridor, shoulders heavy, the echo of Marcus's voice still cutting into him. "Mr. Greene." The voice was thin but steady. From the shadows stepped Eleanor Price, a woman in her 70s, gray hair tied back, glasses slipping low on her nose. She had been Whitmore's accountant for decades, so quiet most forgot she was there. But Harold remembered. She had been present in 2008, silent at the back of the room. "What are you doing here, Eleanor?" Harold asked, tired but wary. She clutched a leather folder to her chest. Her hands trembled. "I couldn't leave tonight. Not after what they did to you. Not after seeing that boy's face." Harold's eyes softened. "Marcus." Eleanor nodded. "I saw it all. They humiliated you, just like they did 15 years ago." Her voice cracked and she pressed her lips tight. Harold tilted his head. "You know." "I know more than I ever admitted," Eleanor whispered. She glanced down the hall, making sure they were alone. Then she opened the folder. Inside was a sealed envelope, yellowed with time. "I kept something. A copy." From 2008, Harold froze. The world seemed to narrow to that envelope. She swallowed. "When the Delgado suit crushed you, I told myself there was nothing I could do. I had bills, children in college, a mortgage. I let fear buy my silence. I hid this in my attic, convinced it was safer forgotten." Harold stepped closer. "Why show me now?" Her eyes glistened. "Because tonight I realized forgetting didn't protect me. It only protected them. I watched you dragged like a thief. I saw your nephew turn away. I couldn't let that be the end of it." She pressed the envelope into his hand. Inside are transaction ledgers, the original Addendum C drafts, the pieces they buried. Harold's breath caught. For 15 years he had carried the weight of being called a liar. Now, in his palm, was proof that ghosts could return. Eleanor's voice fell to a whisper. "I was a coward, but maybe this makes me less so." He met her gaze, steady and calm. "Sometimes it only takes one person to keep the flame alive. You kept it, Eleanor. That's courage, not cowardice." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "If they find out—" "They won't, not from you," Harold assured. "You've carried this burden long enough. Let me carry it now." For a moment they stood in silence, two survivors bound by a secret war. Then Eleanor straightened, a quiet resolve settling on her shoulders. "Be careful, Harold. Victor hasn't just inherited Delgado's wealth. He's inherited his ruthlessness." "I know," Harold replied, slipping the envelope into his jacket. "But this time, I'm not standing alone." From the boardroom above, faint laughter echoed, Victor's victory dinner. Harold looked up, jaw set. The past had returned, and with it, a chance to finish what began in 2008. Eleanor touched his arm once, briefly, before retreating into the shadows. Harold remained, the weight of the envelope pressing against his chest like a second heartbeat. For the first time in years he felt something other than defeat. He felt the fire again. The old records room was cold. The flickering lights cast long shadows down the narrow aisles, where the past of Whitmore Holdings slept in cardboard boxes. This was the place Charlotte had chosen. A place for ghosts. Harold arrived first. The humiliation in the lobby still burned on his skin, but beneath it, an old fire had been rekindled. Eleanor's envelope felt like a second heart beating in his pocket. When the door creaked, he flinched, the instinct of a man hunted for 15 years. But it was Charlotte. She stepped inside, holding a file of her own. Tonight, she wasn't the billionaire on magazine covers. She was just a woman standing at a crossroads she couldn't see the end of. "Mr. Greene," she said, her voice low. "Or should I say, Harvard, class of '96? Harold didn't flinch, but a flicker of sorrow crossed his eyes. "That man was buried a long time ago, Miss Whitmore." "Perhaps," Charlotte replied, closing the door, the sound echoing in the silence. "But tonight, I think he's back." Eleanor entered right after, her breath short. She looked at Harold, then at Charlotte, clutching her leather folder like a shield. For a moment, 3 people from 3 different worlds stood in silence. A queen, an old soldier, and a keeper of secrets, all bound by one man's betrayal. Charlotte broke the silence. "We don't have much time." "He already suspects everything," Harold said. His tone held no bitterness, only the tired acceptance of a man long familiar with the fight. "The spectacle in the lobby wasn't just to humiliate me. It was a warning shot, fired at you." "And yet, here you are," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling with admiration. She placed her folder on the dusty table. "The proof I hid for 15 years. I was too afraid to use it and too ashamed to destroy it." Charlotte opened it. The faded numbers told a story of greed and lies. They matched what she had found. "Addendum C," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the same playbook." "They're running the same fraud," Harold confirmed. "Because you're clean, because you trust. That makes you their perfect cover." Eleanor's gaze dropped, the shame of the past washing over her. "They used me the same way once. 15 years later, I still wake up in guilt." "Then we don't let history repeat," Charlotte declared, her voice finding its CEO's resolve. She looked at Harold. "And you? Why keep fighting when they've taken everything from you?" Harold was quiet for a long moment. He wasn't looking at the files. He was looking into the space between them, at memories only he could see. "Because they haven't taken the truth," he said, his voice low and raw, "and because they took my daughter from me. They made her father a liar in her eyes. I may never get back what I lost, but I will not let Victor Delgado use that same lie to destroy anyone else." The words landed with the weight of an oath. For the first time, Charlotte and Eleanor didn't just see a whistleblower, they saw a father. Meanwhile, in a dark corner of the hallway, Sophia hid behind a filing cabinet. Her loyalty was to Charlotte, but her logic screamed that her boss was walking into a trap. A janitor? A retiring accountant? These were her allies? Her gut twisted. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over a name, Victor Delgado. She didn't press call. Not yet. Miles away, Marcus Greene lay on his bed, curled in the darkness. His own accusation, "You're a coward," echoed in his head. But the image that haunted him wasn't his own anger. It was the sorrow in his uncle's eyes, a sorrow that seemed to be not for himself, but for Marcus. He buried his face in his pillow, the guilt gnawing at him. Then why didn't you fight back? The question refused to sleep. Back in the records room, a fragile alliance had formed. "We'll move carefully," Charlotte said, her voice calm and strategic again. "Eleanor, can you access the old servers?" The old accountant nodded, her hands steadier. "Now." "I know the back doors." "Harold," Charlotte turned to him, "you know how Victor thinks. Where are his weaknesses?" "Victor's weakness is his pride," Harold answered. "He believes he destroyed me once and he can do it again. He will underestimate us." Charlotte nodded. "Then that's exactly what we'll use." The storm was gathering, not just in boardrooms but in the hearts of ordinary people, and at its center, 3 unlikely allies had just lit the first spark. The next morning, Victor struck. No warning, no preamble, just one leaked email to a journalist, and the storm hit. Charlotte's phone erupted. Financial news alerts exploded across her screen, each one a knife twist. Harold Greene, from whistleblower to saboteur, the troubled past of the Whitmore Holdings, Janitor Warner. Victor hadn't attacked the Harold of today. He had weaponized the Harold of the past. The articles selectively retold the 2008 story, painting Harold as a disgruntled, unreliable figure. His 15 years of silence were now reframed as an admission of guilt. In his utility closet, Harold scrolled through the headlines on an old phone. His face was impassive. He had expected this. He set the phone down and got back to work. Silence was his only reply. But the world wasn't silent. Staff whispered as he passed. Suspicious eyes followed him. Charlotte called an emergency meeting. "This is a coordinated smear campaign," she declared, "and it leads back to Victor." But the board was spooked. "Charlotte, your association with this man is a liability," one member said. "The company's reputation is taking a hit." That evening, she found Harold sweeping near the elevators. "They're destroying you," she said, her voice urgent. "Why don't you defend yourself?" Harold didn't stop sweeping. "If I answer, I make his lie a debate," he said, his voice even. "If I remain silent, the lie must carry its own weight. Lies tire faster than truth." Elsewhere, Eleanor Price read the articles, her hands shaking. She saw the difference between her silence then and Harold's now. Hers was fear. His was resolve. At school, Marcus faced the taunts. "Hey, isn't this your uncle?" a friend laughed, shoving a phone in his face. Shame burned in his chest. He hated his uncle's silence, but deep down, a question began to form. Why did that silence feel like dignity? In his penthouse, Victor sipped scotch and watched Whitmore's stock tremble. He had sown chaos. He believed he was erasing Harold from the story. But he had miscalculated. Silence doesn't erase. It echoes. The following week, at a gala, a major donor approached Charlotte. "I read about that man, Harold Greene," he said, intrigued. "What a strange story." Harold's name, instead of being buried, was now on everyone's lips. Victor had turned him into a mystery. The next morning, Sophia entered Charlotte's office. "The board is calling a meeting," she said, her tone tense. "They're citing your association with Harold Greene." Charlotte looked her assistant straight in the eye. "What do you believe, Sophia?" Sophia hesitated. "I believe you're risking everything for a man who refuses to fight." "The fight isn't for his name," Charlotte replied, rolling the rosewood pen in her fingers. "It's for the truth, and the truth never defends itself. It waits." The storm Victor unleashed grew, but at its eye stood Harold Greene, unmoved. Victor thought he had buried Harold. What he didn't see was that his silence had turned Harold into something he could never crush. A question. ChatGPT said, "Rain misted off the glass as Harold stepped out of Whitmore Tower. No umbrella, no hurry. Just the quiet gait of a man the headlines had already tried to bury." Sophia shadowed him from half a block back. Hoodie over blazer, phone on silent. She told herself this was security. Truthfully, it was curiosity sharpened into doubt. Harold cut into a narrow side street where neon hummed and shop gates were down. A bus hissed. A boy hopped off, shoulders squared, eyes bright with anger. "Marcus." He stopped a few feet from Harold. "You shouldn't be here." Harold didn't flinch. "I always am." "They say you torched your own career," Marcus shot back. "Mom believes it. Everyone does." A patrol car rolled past the alley mouth. Blue light brushed brick. Sophia ducked behind a pillar, thumb hovering over a text to Victor. "Found him. With the kid." She didn't send it. Harold's voice stayed low. "You don't need to believe me." Marcus scoffed. "Then why talk to me at all?" "So you can watch." Harold took one slow step closer. "Watch how I live. How I keep showing up. Justice doesn't die, Marcus. It waits. It wears people down until one person refuses to look away." The words were a whisper, but they hit like a bell. Marcus swallowed. "Words don't fix anything." "They don't, but they plant things," Harold said, "and planted things crack concrete." Sophia exhaled without meaning to. Not a speech, not a plea, a line that sounded lived. A bus whooshed by, scattering drizzle. Marcus stared at the reflection of the two of them in a dark shop window. A kid and a janitor who wouldn't bend. "If justice waits, why didn't you fight in the lobby?" "I did," Harold said. "I chose not to swing at a stage Victor built for me. He wanted noise. I let him have silence. That looked like fear." It looked like dignity from where I stood. Marcus looked away, jaw tight. I called you a coward. I heard. You didn't deny it. I'm saving my breath. For what? For when someone's ready to hear. Silence. The kind that stings. Sophia's phone buzzed. Victor. Board call in 10. Status. She raised the camera, framing the two figures in the rain. Evidence. Insurance. Her thumb hovered over record. Marcus finally broke. If I watch and it turns out you're lying, then I'll have earned your anger, Harold said. But if I'm not, you'll have wasted none of your courage. Another silence, shorter this time. Marcus's shoulders sagged. I hate that you talk like that. I hate that I have to. A door clanged somewhere. Footsteps. A security guard cut across the corner of the alley, glanced in, kept moving. Sophia held her breath until he was gone. Marcus shoved his hands deeper into his pockets. I'm not promising anything. You don't need to. But I'll... Look, he muttered. That's all. That's enough. Marcus turned away, then pivoted back, voice rough. They said you stole a folder, did you? Harold met his eyes. No. No flourish, no defense, just the word. Marcus nodded once, almost imperceptible, and walked. Not fast, not far, just out of sight. Sophia lowered her phone. Her fingers still hadn't hit record. She stared at the screen, at the unsent text to Victor. She could deliver leverage in a tap. She didn't. Harold leaned against the brick, closed his eyes for a beat, breathed. When he opened them, he was looking straight where Sophia hid. She froze. I know you're there, he said, not turning. If you need to follow me, but don't follow his script. Sophia stepped into the spill of neon. Whose script? You already know. She searched his face for arrogance, manipulation, weakness, anything she could file away. She found none, just a steady, infuriating calm. You think one line fixes what he did to you? She asked. One line doesn't fix, Harold said. One line holds. Justice doesn't die, she repeated, almost mocking, and couldn't quite pull it off. He nodded once. Say it when you're alone. See if it feels stupid or true. A beat. Rain ticked on metal. Sophia pocketed her phone. If Charlotte signs, he wins. If Charlotte sees, he doesn't. She's seeing, Sophia said, surprising herself with how certain it sounded. Harold's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Something like relief refusing to be obvious. Then, keep her seeing. I work for her, not for you. Good, Harold said. Working for her means working against the lie. Sophia glanced toward the avenue, toward the tower with Victor's name glowing 14 floors up. She felt the line inside her, habit on one side, conscience on the other, shift by a hair. Don't mistake my curiosity for belief, she said. I won't. And don't mistake my silence for loyalty. I never do. Another buzz. Victor. On the line. Now Sophia typed back, on my way, then she didn't move. Marcus won't thank you, she said. Not today. Maybe not ever. Justice doesn't keep receipts, Harold said. Sophia almost laughed. Almost. You're very annoying. So, I've heard. She started toward the avenue, then stopped and looked back. The streetlight threw Harold's shadow long behind him, thin and stubborn. Tomorrow, she said, don't leave through the lobby. I wasn't planning to. She vanished into the traffic glow. Harold stood alone, head tipped to the rain, eyes closed. Somewhere behind the clouds, morning was already arranging itself. In a bedroom across town, Marcus lay awake, Harold's whisper unspooling in the dark like a dare. Watch me live. He didn't text, he didn't call, but he pulled the curtains and set his alarm early. And in an elevator rising toward the boardroom, Sophia stared at her reflection and didn't recognize the certainty in her eyes. Not belief. Not yet. A crack. That was all. Sometimes a crack is where the light begins. Charlotte hadn't meant to linger in the office that late, but something in her refused to leave. Whitmore Tower at midnight was a mausoleum of glass, humming with silent power. She walked the corridors like a restless ghost, clutching the rosewood pen she'd taken from Harold. It no longer felt like an object. It felt like a key. She found herself drifting toward the lowest floor, the custodial wing. The hum of fluorescent lights and the smell of floor wax filled the air. And then she saw him. Harold Greene, seated alone at a battered wooden desk, the mop bucket pushed aside. His posture wasn't broken as she expected. It was composed, steady, as though he were still a man in a boardroom. In his hand, the pen. Her pen, yet not hers. The rosewood gleamed under the weak light. He was writing, not numbers, but lines. Lines shaped like stanzas. Poetry. Charlotte froze. She watched his lips move as he wrote, soundless, carrying the rhythm of a vow. She should have left, but instead she stood transfixed. This was no janitor scribbling nonsense. This was a man using the last weapon left to him. Words. And the words came from somewhere else. 2002. The small Chinatown bookstore was cramped, stacked floor to ceiling with poetry collections. Harold, then in his 30s, was lost among translations he barely understood. And then he heard her voice. "Looking for something?" she asked, her accent delicate, her tone unafraid. Her name was Mei Lin, an American-born Chinese poet with a smile that carried both mischief and wisdom. "I don't know what I'm looking for," Harold admitted. "Then you need a guide," she said. She became his guide, not just in books, but in life. Mei Lin taught him Mandarin words wrapped in music. She taught him to see numbers not as sterile figures, but as stories of people's lives. She urged him to leave the safe accounting firm and pursue finance, where integrity was rare and desperately needed. On their wedding day, she placed a gift in his hand, a rosewood pen. "You'll sign contracts with this," she whispered, "but I hope you'll write truth with it, too." 2008. The year truth betrayed him. That was the same year Mei Lin fell ill, a diagnosis swift and merciless. He had been fighting Delgado's empire by day, standing vigil at a hospital bed by night. She grew weaker as his world collapsed. When the lawsuit branded him a liar, when colleagues spat his name, she took his hand and said, "Don't let them take your honor, Harold. They can take everything else, but not that." She pressed the pen back into his palm one last time. 3 weeks later, she was gone. The obituary called her a local poet. For Harold, she had been everything. Back in the present, Charlotte gripped the doorframe to steady herself. She had read articles about Harold Greene, whistleblower turned ghost. But no article carried this: the widow's pen, the poetry, the love carved into silence. She stepped closer before she could stop herself. "What are you writing?" Harold didn't startle. He lifted his eyes slowly, and Charlotte saw they were wet but unbroken. "A promise," he said simply. "One I made 15 years ago, and one I'll make until my hand can't move." She lowered herself into the chair across from him, unable to stop trembling. "All this time, I thought you were warning me as an analyst, an accountant, but you weren't." "I was warning you as a husband," Harold said. He closed the notebook. "She believed truth is a form of love. That's all I have left to give." Charlotte felt tears sting her eyes before she realized she was crying. She tried to wipe them away, but Harold didn't look at her with pity. He simply let her weep, as though grief itself was a shared language. The pen gleamed between them, no longer just wood and ink. It was a relic, soaked in vows, in betrayal, in survival. Charlotte whispered, "I've signed billion-dollar contracts. I've been named the most powerful woman on Wall Street. But I have never seen power like this. A man with nothing, still fighting with a pen." Harold gave the faintest smile. "Then you see why Delgado fears me. Not because I'm dangerous, but because I survived him, and survival is proof he can be beaten." The words cut deeper than any data. Charlotte realized she wasn't just standing at the edge of a risky contract. She was standing inside someone else's unfinished war, and that war had claimed not just fortunes, but a wife, a life, a legacy. She looked again at the pen. For Harold, it was memory. For her, it was revelation. "Do you still write to her?" Charlotte asked softly. "Every night," Harold admitted. "I tell her I haven't given up, that I'll make her right." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, binding them. A billionaire, a janitor, a widow's ghost. For the first time, Charlotte felt the true weight of the fight she was about to enter. She stood. "Keep writing," she said, her voice breaking, "but don't write alone." And for the first time in years, Harold felt something shift. Not pity, not charity. Alliance. When Charlotte left the room, she wiped her tears with the back of her hand. She didn't care if anyone saw, because those tears weren't weakness. They were the beginning of resolve. Mini High Point number 3 had arrived quietly, not with shouting, not with scandal, but with poetry. Charlotte had witnessed a man stripped of everything still holding on to love and honor with the same hand that pushed a mop. The storm was gathering, and tonight its center was no longer Delgado. It was a janitor with a rosewood pen. The room smelled of dust and old ink. The records Eleanor had carried trembled in her hands as she placed them on the table. Charlotte closed the blinds herself, the billionaire reduced to a conspirator. Harold leaned against the wall, silent as always, his eyes tracing every shadow. And Sophia, Charlotte's sharp, skeptical assistant, stood near the door, arms folded tight as though bracing against a storm she wasn't sure she wanted to join. Charlotte began. "We can't expose Delgado with outrage. He controls the board, the media, the regulators. If we charge at him head-on, we'll be crushed. We need precision, delay, misdirection." Harold finally spoke. His voice was calm, clipped. "That's how he wins. Control of timing. If we seize time from him, even briefly, he'll stumble." Eleanor's voice cracked as she opened her folder. "The documents I kept, they're incomplete, but they show the pattern. The same shell companies, the same laundering. If we can align them with current contracts, we prove history repeating." Charlotte nodded. "I can stall the board, delay the vote on the merger. That buys us time to collect and confirm." "And me?" Sophia asked suddenly. Her tone was sharper than she intended, but her eyes betrayed uncertainty. "You're Delgado's favorite," Charlotte said bluntly. "He thinks your ambition can be bought. We'll let him believe that. You'll feed him just enough to keep his guard down. But when the moment comes, you'll turn." Sophia bristled. "So I play the traitor?" "No," Harold interrupted softly. His gaze was steady, unsettling in its clarity. "You play yourself. The choice will be yours." Silence filled the room, heavier than any plan. Charlotte broke it. "Eleanor, you'll prepare the evidence for release." "Harold." She hesitated, almost unwilling to command him. "You appear when they least expect. At the vote, or before, when the board is cornered. Your silence frightens him more than your words." Harold's lips curved, not quite a smile. "Good. Fear is the only language he speaks." The plan was fragile, like glass balanced on the edge of a table, but it was all they had. That night, Sophia couldn't sleep. She wandered the tower's silent hallways, her heels echoing in empty marble. She told herself she was only ensuring security, but the truth gnawed at her. She couldn't stop thinking about Harold Greene. Rounding a corner, she saw him, alone, bent over, mop in hand. The mighty whistleblower, the man who had once faced senators and CEOs, now scrubbing footprints from polished floors. He didn't see her. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost reverent, as though even cleaning was an act of dignity. Sophia pressed herself into the shadows, watching. At first she felt contempt, then confusion, then, unexpectedly, something sharp in her chest. She remembered her father, a mechanic, his hands scarred and dirty, who told her work done with honesty had its own kind of nobility. She had buried that memory under ambition, under loyalty to power. But here it was again, alive in the sight of Harold Greene wiping marble. She didn't notice the tears until one slid down her cheek. She turned quickly, ashamed, wiping it away as though tears were betrayal. But she couldn't unsee what she had seen. The next morning, Charlotte called them together once more. The air was tighter, the urgency greater. "Victor will sense movement," she said. "He'll strike with media, smear campaigns, maybe even audits. We counter not with denial, but with patience. The board must believe they're safe while the trap closes." Harold added, "Our strength is not speed, but inevitability. Every lie he tells will point back to the truth if we position it right." Eleanor straightened her shoulders. "I'll digitize everything I have. Once it's live, he can't bury it again." "And me," Sophia said, her voice quieter than usual. "I'll walk the knife's edge. He'll test me. I'll let him believe I'm leaning his way. But when the time comes—" She hesitated, then looked at Harold. "I won't fail." Charlotte caught the subtle crack in her assistant's voice but said nothing. Trust wasn't demanded here. It had to be chosen. The plan was set. Charlotte would stall, Sophia would deceive, Eleanor would deliver, and Harold. Harold would wait in the shadows until the moment mattered most. As they parted, Harold lingered. He placed the rosewood pen on the table for a moment, letting it rest there like a standard planted in battle. "This isn't about revenge," he said quietly. "It's about honor. If we lose sight of that, we've already lost." Charlotte touched the pen, nodding. Eleanor whispered, "I've waited 15 years for this." Sophia, silent, only glanced once more at Harold, and for the first time saw not a janitor, but a man who refused to be erased. Outside, the city roared on, blind to the storm gathering inside Whitmore Tower. But in the quiet, a fragile plan had been born, and in Sophia's hidden tears, the first fracture in Victor's power had already begun. The boardroom shimmered with glass and steel, a fortress of wealth and power. Victor Delgado stood at the head of the table, tailored suit immaculate, smile sharpened like a blade. Around him, board members shifted in their leather chairs, waiting. Charlotte Whitmore sat opposite, the weight of $1 billion signature pressing down on her. On the polished table she placed a single object, the rosewood pen. It gleamed under the chandelier. The gesture was deliberate. Victor's eyes flicked to it. "A fitting tool to sign your future, Charlotte," he said smoothly. "Don't keep us waiting. The merger must be sealed today." Her fingers brushed the pen, but her eyes didn't leave his. "You're in quite a hurry, Victor." "Markets don't wait," he replied, "and neither should you." Behind her, Sophia stood poised with a slim laptop bag. To everyone else, she looked like Victor's ally, the assistant who had grown weary of Charlotte's hesitation. Only Harold and Eleanor knew the truth. Victor pushed a folder forward. "Sign, Charlotte. Secure your legacy, or risk losing everything." Charlotte's hand hovered over the page. Then she let the pen drop with a hollow clink. The sound echoed in the silence. "No," she said softly. Murmurs rippled across the table. Victor leaned closer, voice a hiss meant only for her. "Don't play games with me. You know what happens to those who resist." Charlotte's gaze hardened. "I also know what happens to those who trust you." Before Victor could respond, Sophia stepped forward. "Perhaps I can help clarify." She opened her bag and drew out a sleek projector. The board members exchanged puzzled looks. Victor raised a brow, lips curling. "You see," he said, spreading his hands, "even your assistant understands where loyalty belongs." Sophia smiled thinly. "Yes, Victor. Loyalty." She plugged in the device. The projector hummed, light spilling across the glass wall. Numbers and charts flickered into existence. At first, the board leaned forward, eager for data. But then the transfers appeared. Shell companies, offshore accounts, patterns of siphoned funds. A spiderweb of theft. Delgado Capital at the center. Gasps filled the room. Victor's smile froze. "What is this?" "Your empire," Sophia said, her voice calm, "built on stolen lives." He turned on her, fury blazing. "You dare!" But Charlotte cut him off, her voice steel. "These records don't lie. They match the warnings Harold Greene raised in 2008. The same schemes, the same deceit." Board members exchanged frantic whispers. One elderly director adjusted his glasses, scanning the data. These are authenticated transfers." Victor slammed his fist on the table. "Fabrications, staged by a bitter janitor and a senile accountant." The door opened. Harold Greene stepped inside. His uniform was plain, but the weight he carried silenced the room. He walked slowly, deliberately, and placed a second folder on the table. Eleanor's documents neatly organized. "Not fabrications," Harold said, his voice low but unshakable. "History, and history always leaves a trail." The projector's light caught the rosewood pen, beside the contract. It seemed to glow, the silent witness of 15 years. Victor sneered. You're nothing. A man the world already forgot." Harold met his gaze. "Then why are you afraid?" The question landed like a blow. For the first time, Victor's composure cracked. Charlotte leaned back, letting silence build until the weight of evidence pressed harder than any accusation. "The choice is simple," she told the board. "Sign away this company to Delgado, or see the truth for yourselves." One director whispered, "SEC will want this." Another muttered, "We can't be complicit." Victor tried to recover, his charm snapping back into place. "Don't be fools. This is a distraction, designed to poison your trust. Charlotte is gambling with shadows." But Sophia clicked again. A final slide appeared. Addendum C. The very clause Victor had buried, resurrected in black and white. Eleanor's voice trembled, but she spoke with conviction. "I kept this 15 years. Too afraid then, not afraid now." The room erupted in chaos, voices overlapping, directors demanding explanations. Victor turned on Sophia, venom in his tone. "Traitor!" Her chin lifted, eyes wet but steady. "Number survivor? I believed in you once. That was my mistake. I won't make it again." Victor lunged to seize the laptop, but Harold was faster. He stepped between them, the boardroom's polished floor reflecting the standoff. For a heartbeat, the janitor and the tycoon faced each other in silence. Charlotte reached out and lifted the pen again. She didn't sign the contract. She signed a single line on Eleanor's evidence, her name standing as validation, as shield. The symbolism was unmistakable. The board members watched in stunned silence. "This," Charlotte said, holding the signed page aloft, "is my legacy." Truth, not submission. The projector still glowed. The documents still lay open. And Victor Delgado, master of illusions, stood cornered in a room of mirrors he had built himself. The boardroom was chaos. Directors shouted over one another, the glow of the projector flickering across their shocked faces. Charlotte's refusal had cracked the surface, but it wasn't enough to sink Victor. He still stood tall, voice commanding, eyes burning with menace. And then Eleanor Price rose. The elderly accountant's hands trembled as she clutched a thick folder, its edges worn from years hidden in the dark. Her knees shook as if the weight of the paper was heavier than stone, but her eyes had found clarity. "I can't stay silent any longer," she said. The room fell still. Even Victor froze, sensing something dangerous. Eleanor opened the folder. Inside were spreadsheets, memos, photocopied ledgers, pieces of the scandal that had burned 15 years ago. She laid them on the table one by one, her voice steadying as she spoke. In 2008, I witnessed these transactions. I knew what they meant. Harold Greene warned us. I helped bury it. She stopped, breath trembling before forcing the words out. I let them convince me it was nothing, that Harold was a liar. I watched him fall. The directors stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. She had always been a fixture of the firm, gray-haired and forgettable. But now she stood like a survivor dragging her truth from the grave. Victor snarled, "This is absurd. She's senile. No one takes her seriously." Eleanor's back straightened. She turned toward Harold in the corner of the room. Her voice softened. "I lost my courage then. But tonight, because of him, I found it again." She lifted the final page. An original memo stamped with Delgado capital seal, warning of Addendum C. The exact clause Charlotte had discovered. The document Victor had erased from the archives. Gasps erupted. A director whispered, "Authentic seal." Another muttered, "This corroborates Greene." Eleanor pressed her palms to the table. "I have lived with silence for 15 years. I buried my conscience under fear, but I will not die with this secret in my chest. Harold Greene was right then. He is right now." She turned toward Charlotte, eyes brimming with tears. "Do not sign, Ms. Whitmore. This isn't just about money. This is about every worker whose pension vanished, every family betrayed. I cannot undo the past, but tonight I can choose truth." Charlotte's throat tightened. The directors leaned forward, riveted. Eleanor looked straight at Victor. "You may call me a coward, and maybe I was, but today, thanks to Harold, I take back my voice." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Victor's mask cracked. "Enough! She's irrelevant, just a frightened bookkeeper grasping for attention. This changes nothing." But it changed everything. For the first time, the board members looked at Victor not with admiration, but suspicion. Doubt crept into their eyes. Charlotte picked up the rosewood pen again. "You wanted me to sign, Victor. Maybe I will, but not for you." She tapped Eleanor's documents. For her. For the truth she carried when all of us were too blind to see. The directors erupted again, voices colliding. Eleanor stood straighter, a fragile but undeniable pillar. In the corner, Harold lowered his gaze, a flicker of gratitude passing across his face. For 15 years, he had been alone. Tonight, he was not. And the boardroom, once Victor's arena, had begun to tilt. The tension broke with a sudden sound. The boardroom doors slammed open. All heads turned. Harold Greene stepped through, no longer a shadow. His janitor's uniform was plain, but the way he walked, measured, unflinching, commanded the room. In his hand, he carried nothing but dignity and the echo of truth. Victor's face twisted. "You don't belong here." But Harold kept moving. His eyes swept across the table, pausing at Charlotte, at Eleanor, before settling on the rosewood pen lying in the center. He reached for it. Fingers scarred from years of labor closed around the polished wood his late wife had given him. He lifted it as though reclaiming not just a tool, but a life once stolen. Silence gripped the boardroom. Harold spoke, his voice low but carrying. 15 years ago, I stood in another room like this. I warned about Addendum C. They called me a liar. They broke me. But the numbers never lied, and the truth never died. He placed the pen gently on the contract but didn't sign. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small recorder. He pressed play. A crackling voice filled the room. Victor Delgado, unmistakable, speaking in a private call recorded days earlier. "Charlotte, don't test me. You sign, or you'll end up like Greene, dragged through the mud until even your own blood disowns you. We buried him once. We'll bury you too." The words slammed into the silence. Directors paled. Sophia, standing near the projector, felt her stomach knot. She had doubted Harold, but the recording shattered any question. Victor leapt to his feet. "This is illegal. Fabricated." But Harold didn't waver. He clicked the recorder off and looked Victor in the eye. "Threats, lies, intimidation. The same weapons you used in 2008. You thought I was gone. You thought silence would last forever." Victor's voice cracked with fury. "You ruined everything. You destroyed my family's legacy. You—" His voice broke into a scream. "You killed my father." The room froze. Charlotte's eyes widened. The board members turned, stunned. Eleanor gasped. Victor's chest heaved. His control splintered. The polished tycoon's mask had shattered into raw venom. Harold's gaze softened. Not pity, not triumph, but sorrow. He spoke quietly, each word like a verdict. "I didn't kill your father. Ambition did. Lies did. He built his empire on poison, and you drank it deeper. The truth didn't kill him, Victor. The truth only revealed what was already rotting." Victor staggered, the weight of the words striking harder than any blow. Charlotte rose, her voice steady. "You hear it yourselves. A confession, a threat, a legacy of corruption." She turned to the board. "Decide now. Who will you stand with? The man who builds on deceit, or the one who stood alone with nothing but the truth?" The directors murmured, shaken. Some avoided Victor's gaze. Others looked at Harold as though seeing him for the first time, not as a janitor, but as the man who had carried a burden too heavy for one life. Harold placed the recorder next to the pen. Two objects, one of memory, one of proof. Together, they were undeniable. Victor's fists clenched, his fury desperate. "None of this matters. You think anyone cares about the truth? Power decides, not justice." Harold finally looked at him fully, his voice calm but resolute. "Then let's see whose power lasts when truth walks in." The boardroom, once Victor's kingdom, had shifted. The witnesses had spoken. The evidence had spoken. And Harold Greene, broken, erased, forgotten, had walked back into the light. For the first time in 15 years, he was no longer the accused. He was the accuser. The boardroom went silent. The recorder still lay beside the rosewood pen, proof heavier than stone. Victor swayed, searching for words that would not come. Then the doors burst open. Uniformed officers swept in, badges raised. City police, everyone remained seated. Chairs scraped, directors froze. Charlotte's eyes flicked to Sophia. Eleanor gripped the table, steady for the first time in years. A detective stepped forward. "Victor Delgado, you are under arrest for conspiracy, securities fraud, and witness intimidation." They spun him around. Handcuffs clicked tight. The sound cut sharper than any gavel. Victor didn't resist. The fight had drained from him the moment truth had taken form. His eyes passed over the contract, over the projector's fading light, and locked on Harold. Not hate, not fire, emptiness. The hollow look of a man staring at a wall that would never move. He whispered, "There's nothing left, is there?" Harold met his gaze, calm, almost kind. "There is what you choose next." A thin laugh escaped Victor, brittle, hopeless. "Next? There's no next for men like me." Harold's reply was steady. "There's always a next for men." The officers pulled Victor toward the door. He looked to Charlotte once more, searching for leverage, but her face was iron. Sophia met his eyes and didn't blink. Eleanor straightened her back. In the doorway stood Marcus. He had come on instinct, called by whispers. Now he saw it with his own eyes. His uncle in cuffs, and Harold standing tall in the storm. Marcus exhaled, shoulders easing. Shame loosened its grip. "Sir," a detective said to Harold, "we'll need your statement." "You'll have it," Harold answered. Victor slowed when he saw Marcus. For a heartbeat, Empire and boy shared the same air. Victor searched his nephew's face for anger, fear, anything to cling to. He found nothing, only clear, young eyes unwilling to follow. He turned back to Harold, voice thin. "You couldn't save me." "I wasn't asked to," Harold said, "but I saved what you tried to break." Victor frowned. "What's that?" "Time," Harold said, "for others to heal." The words landed like stone. Victor sagged. A detective tugged him forward. He went quietly. The board exhaled in fragments. One director leaned back, whispering a prayer. Another picked up a phone, already calling counsel. Charlotte reached for the rosewood pen. She didn't sign. She capped it, set it gently atop Eleanor's evidence, and slid it to the table's center. An altar to truth. Sophia powered down the projector. The room dimmed like a theater after the credits. She looked at Harold. "Are you okay?" "I am," he said. Eleanor touched his sleeve. "We'll have to testify." "We will," Harold answered. "Together." Marcus stepped closer. His voice shook. "Uncle?" Harold turned. No judgment, only patience. "I was wrong," Marcus whispered. "I'll watch." "Then walk with me," Harold said. Outside, the corridor glowed with morning that had ignored the night's battle. Officers led Victor down the hall. Cameras waited beyond the elevators. He held his head up by habit, but something had gone out of him. Smaller, lighter only in the way a fallen stone is lighter once lifted. Harold closed the boardroom door. The click was soft, almost gentle. Inside, truth remained. Outside, sirens faded. And between them, a life resumed. The boardroom still hummed with the echo of handcuffs. The silence that followed was thick, almost sacred. Charlotte remained at the head of the table, her hand resting on the rosewood pen. For a long moment, she did not speak. All eyes waited. Finally, Charlotte stood. Her voice was calm, steady, yet tinged with something no one had ever heard from her before: humility. "I owe this man an apology." The directors stirred. Some frowned, others leaned forward. But Charlotte did not falter. She lifted the pen, holding it high enough for every gaze to follow. "This pen is more than wood and ink," she said. "It belonged to Harold Greene, a man I dismissed, a man I mocked, a man who, while I thrived on privilege, bore the weight of truth in silence." She turned toward Harold. He stood by the wall, not triumphant, only composed, his eyes lowered as if unsure whether he had the right to meet hers. "I was blind," Charlotte confessed. "I let ambition drown out decency. I let Victor deceive me because it was easier to believe in power than to believe in a janitor with calloused hands." She paused, emotion tightening her voice. "But those hands have done more for this company, for justice, than all of us sitting here." She walked toward Harold. Each step echoed like a drumbeat. When she stopped in front of him, the room held its breath. She extended the pen with both hands, as if returning a crown. "Mr. Greene," Charlotte said, her voice breaking, "this belongs to you, along with the honor we stole, along with the truth we buried. I can't undo 15 years, but today I can begin to make it right." For a moment, Harold did not move. His eyes glistened, his body rigid. Slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing the pen as though it might vanish if he held it too firmly. When it settled into his palm, the room felt lighter, as though some invisible chain had been cut. Applause began softly. One pair of hands, then another. Within seconds, the entire boardroom was on its feet. The sound rolled like thunder, not polite but fierce, cleansing. Eleanor pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. Tears spilled freely, not of shame this time, but of release. For 15 years, she had carried silence, like a coffin. Now the coffin was open, the weight lifted. She let the tears fall, uncaring who saw. Sophia stood behind Charlotte, her expression unreadable at first, but then, slowly, a smile formed, small, hesitant as if testing its own truth. For the first time, she believed justice was not a myth. Watching Harold, she felt a strange warmth, not just respect, but faith. Charlotte turned back to the table. We were nearly complicit in another crime, but this man stopped it, not with power, not with wealth, but with integrity. If Whitmore Holdings stands tomorrow, it will be because of him. The applause grew louder, shaking the walls. Harold bowed his head, not in pride, but in quiet acceptance. The pen in his hand gleamed under the lights, a symbol now visible to everyone, of love, of loss, of resilience that no smear could erase. Marcus slipped into the room, drawn by the noise. He froze when he saw his uncle standing before a cheering crowd, pen in hand. For the first time, he saw Harold not as a broken man but as a survivor who had turned pain into power. Pride flushed his face. He clapped, harder than anyone else, his young voice joining the chorus. "That's my uncle." Harold heard him. For the first time in years, the weight in his chest eased. He lifted the pen slightly, not as a weapon, not as a trophy, but as a promise, to his wife, to his daughter, to the truth itself. The standing ovation did not fade quickly. It swelled, wave after wave, as though the company itself was purging its sins. Even the most hardened directors joined in, their applause both tribute and confession. At last, Charlotte raised her hand, quieting the room. From this day forward, Whitmore Holdings will not be built on deception. It will be built on truth, and truth has a face. She gestured toward Harold. "This man's face." The applause erupted again. Eleanor wept openly. Sophia smiled through tears. Marcus stood tall, and Charlotte bowed her head in respect. Harold remained still, pen in hand, serenity etched on his features. He was no longer invisible. His honor had been restored, not by force, but by truth shining brighter than lies. The boardroom had emptied, but Marcus remained. He crossed the room in hesitant steps, his chest rising and falling with unspoken words. Harold stood near the window, the city lights behind him like a crown of fire. Marcus's voice cracked. "Uncle, you're the strongest man I know." Harold turned slowly. For years, shame had weighed him down, but now his shoulders were straight, his gaze calm. He placed a hand on Marcus's back, steady and warm. "No, son. Strength isn't enough. You must go farther than me. That's the real victory." Marcus's throat tightened. He pressed his face into Harold's chest, a silent vow passing between them. Harold lifted the rosewood pen, its polished grain catching the light. His voice fell into a whisper, not meant for applause, but for truth. "Justice, like a floor, must be cleaned again and again. But when it shines, everyone sees themselves in it." The words lingered in the air, not just for Marcus, but for every soul who had doubted, betrayed, or hoped. The camera drifted outward. The pen gleamed. The janitor, who had been dismissed, mocked, forgotten, stood not as a symbol of defeat, but of honor restored. Harold Greene's story ends here, but stories like his exist all around us. They live in the quiet courage of the overlooked, in the patient truths that wait to be heard. If this story has moved you, if you believe that dignity is a thing that cannot be taken away, then join us. Subscribe to become part of a community dedicated to telling more stories just like this one. Thank you for listening. Because sometimes the most important voices don't shout, they whisper.